Welcome to the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. This podcast is designed to provide momentum in our God-given roles of leadership as we partner together to equip today's Christian leaders for tomorrow's opportunities. Whether you're a pastor, youth leader, ministry volunteer, parent, or student, we want to be your go-to and most trusted resource for equipping and encouragement when it comes to your ministry and leadership influence. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. I'm Eric, and I'll be your host for today's conversation. I'm very excited about this topic, about the conversation, but mostly because of our guest, Tom Barlow. Tom, welcome.
Thanks.
Super excited to have you here with us today in studio. So we're in person. Sometimes we do a Riverside is what the app that we use, but you drove all the way up from Dayton. So Thank you for being here and in person. Tom, you're a former missionary. How long were you and your wife, Marianne, on the field?
About 35 years.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing.
A long time.
That's old. That's longer than I am old.
Yeah.
No, I'm kidding. I'm 42.
Close though.
Close. Yeah. Close. That's amazing. So you guys were church planting. I know you have a heartbeat and a deep desire to do discipleship, to build relationships with people. Where were you at during most of that time?
We were about 12 and a half years in France and then about 22 years in the United Kingdom.
Nice. Okay. In the UK. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, I understand you recently started an organization called Coaching Cultures. Coachingcultures.org is your website, and that your goal is to help churches, businesses thrive in a multicultural and diverse world. Anything you want to share about that and even how that kind of came about?
Yeah, it actually started well before we finished on the field. I was already asking the question after 2008, 2009, kind of the economic crash. What would we do if we weren't able to live on support, the generosity of so many great brothers and sisters who gave for a long time?
Yeah.
And so that's when the idea started to gel already. And then as we neared the end of our time there, we thought, man, the skills we learned to be able to live 35 years abroad seem to be really at a sweet spot for a lot of groups and organizations now, trying to live a multicultural world. Yeah. So that's kind of where the ideas gelled.
Okay. I love what you're doing. You and I have had several Zoom calls as I'm trying to figure out how Momentum can partner with people like you and organizations who are for the local church. That's our heartbeat. We very much want to see the local church thrive, succeed, have success in what God's called us to do. And so I know we've bonded over just our desire to help local churches, pastors be successful. That's a big part of the goal of this podcast even. So you've been on my bucket list of people to reach out to have on a podcast, and we're going to do a 2-part episode. So today in this conversation, what we're hoping to accomplish is really to help you as an individual think through, how do I reach the world around me? Navigating cultural differences is kind of what we're calling this, or the direction we're aiming to go. We'll see where the Lord takes us in conversation. But I think, Tom, this is something that you're obviously gifted at, and helping not only Jesus make sense to individuals who don't know Christ, but primarily in navigating cultural changes and differences. Mm. In our world today, if we're honest, most of us listening, we live in the United States. You have people all around you in your community. It doesn't matter if you live in Amish country, Pennsylvania, or Indiana, or Ohio. You have people of different ethnicities in your community. And you may not be aware of it, or you might be very aware of it. Usually people you see it and you don't know what to do. Maybe you're at Walmart and people are speaking Spanish, and I've heard people make comments like they should speak our language if you're here. And there's some of that breaks my heart, because I'm like, hang on, didn't Jesus himself call us to go and make disciples of all nations? And the process of all nations are here in America. And that's not to make light of or not say that we shouldn't go and be missionaries. I believe we're all called to be on mission with Christ and point people to him in everything we do. And so for some, we are going to be called to go to France or the UK or Africa or wherever.
Yeah.
We need to be open and obedient to that, obviously, when God makes that clear, but also for our hearts just to be open to people of other cultures, people of different ethnicities. Sometimes if we're honest, Tom, and I think a lot of times we're not honest about this, we're afraid to talk to people that are different than us. Maybe it's not even different cultures or ethnicities, but we're afraid to talk to people who are different than us. And so in this conversation, we want to just kind of help people think, give them some practical tools and mindsets, maybe to help move the needle and open up conversation. So why don't we start with just you sharing a little bit about your background, your experience working with people in different cultures, and maybe if you're willing, even share how did you get into moving to France and being in the UK and being a missionary? Yeah,
I'd love to. So I think if I'm honest, growing up in America, like many Americans maybe, I really didn't believe anything existed outside the United States, if I'm really honest, brutally honest with myself. And it was when I met the person who would become my wife, Mary Ann. She had a heart for the nations since she was about 5 or 6.
Wow.
So it's something that started really early. So as we got to know each other at Grace College, the kind of question was, how are we going to do this long distance relationship? Because she wants to go abroad somewhere that I don't have no interest in at all.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go to Kansas or somewhere and start a Grace Brethren Church or whatever. That's really what I was thinking at that point in time. And then we discovered something that was just starting at that point called SOWERS, Serving Overseas Workers. Ed Lewis, someone that Momentum would know well.
It's our former president.
Yeah, exactly. He heard of what Mary Ann's heart was, and so he took us out right after we got married. And he said, this new SOWERS program, you have to be 2. You guys are 2. You have to know another language. Oh, Tom, you know a lot of French, don't you? You have to at least be open to missions. Mary Ann, you're really open to missions, right? And so it was like hand in glove for us.
Wow.
And I thought, I can do 2 years. I can hold my breath, and then we'll come back and do what we're supposed to do in America, right? Because that's right. And so I think God's still laughing, actually, because that's what he used to open my heart and my mind and my eyes to a whole part of the world that has so little opportunity, if they wanted to hear the gospel, to hear about Jesus, to hear the Bible preached. And so during those 2 years, God really did a work on my heart. And then we spent the lion's share of our kind of adult life working abroad, trying to help people who have very little opportunity to hear about God, probably have negative experiences, if any, with the church. And so being the ones who little by little open that door again, that they might consider faith, they might consider what it means to be a Christian. So
that's amazing. I love hearing those stories where God's just kind of taps you on your shoulder and he's like, actually, I like this idea, but we're going to use it over here.
Yeah.
That's so fun. I love it. So what was the beginning, initial stages of that? Did you end up staying for 2 years and come back and then you went back to France, or what was that process like? And then kind of share a little bit of what was your goal while you were over there? What did that planting a church and all of that look like?
Yeah, so we were under dear mentors for about 2 years, David and Susan Griffith. David just passed away, just went home to be with his Savior. And they really took us under arms. So we were there to learn everything we could, help them in any way we could without being a burden. That's why we had to know the language before we went. Yeah. And that ended up being a huge gift because we had to learn French on our own fully. We didn't go to a language school. So we had to meet French people and say, would you help us with the language? And it ended up being the best thing in the world, even though it took a little bit longer and was a little bit harder and a little scarier, to be honest. So, and then we just helped them. So it was meeting anyone we could through any means possible, basically. So we would join some sports clubs, different things that were our interests, our passions, just to be able to meet French people and then to introduce them to that journey of faith. They may be very far from where Jesus is, but to take those little steps to get them closer and closer to that. And then we'd help David and Susan any way we could. Saw a church grow, become a part of that. That was the first 2 years. Then we had to return back because our visa only lasted that long.
Okay.
And we remember saying, we're going to wait 1 year to decide what do we do next. And on our anniversary, because we returned from France on our third anniversary, and on our fourth anniversary, we said, okay, well, what do we do? And it was like, how, after having that experience and be able to learn the culture, how can we stay here where so many, there's so many ministries, so many ways for people to hear about the gospel. So we prepared then, I did my master's, and then 3.5 years later, we were on our way back to France for 10 more years.
Okay. Wow. Beautiful. Tom, do you think that like when you see those things, I love like you got immersed in the culture, you did the hard work to learn the language.
Yeah.
And as you learned that, it sounds like you felt like, well, we did the hard work to do all of that. Those are gifts, abilities, passions that God gave us. We would almost be foolish to not use that and leverage it for his kingdom.
Exactly.
Is that accurate?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who can't. And we realized how much, like learning a language, you have to have the ear. You have to be able to hear it to be able to reproduce it. And those were gifts that God gave us. So we thought, how could we not use those for his sake?
I think there's beauty in that, the model there of there's value in like doing something for a year or two, trying it out, do your part, right?
Yeah.
And let God do his, and let other people do theirs. You can only control what you can control. And so for hearing you say that you were willing, you were obedient, you stepped out in that, and then you're basically like, yeah, this is where we're supposed to be. Let's take the next steps and go back.
Right.
But for some, we know that they might go and do a 2-year stint and they're like, this isn't for me for a number of reasons. And yet when you like come back, maybe God puts you in a place where there is a lot of French speaking people or people that you can still, he leads those processes in amazing ways. We're called to be obedient. So I love that you're sharing that.
And nothing's
highlight and exclamation.
Yeah, nothing's lost in God's economy.
Yes.
Even if someone serves 2 years abroad and then ends up, repatriating back to the States, that's all right. It's not a problem. And it probably gives them eyes to see things that they wouldn't had they not spent that time abroad.
Yeah. All right. So in those early years, then you're living in a new country. You're kind of planting a church. What were some of the things that you learned in how to build relationships with French people? It's a newer language to you now. You're living in their community, not your own, not where you grew up. How did you help start to cross those cultural barriers and lines? You're obviously getting out of your comfort zone in incredible ways. What was kind of that early years process like?
I mean, I think of 3 things right off the bat. One is doing things that I already enjoy or we already know how to do. That made it a bit easier, and finding people who have the same kind of passion. The second one was just breaking the sound barrier. Sometimes it's so hard just to, what do I say? We're fixed on, I don't know what I'm going to say, but just being able to break it, finding a natural way to break in on that. And then the third one was doing it with other people. I don't have to do it all myself. When I was learning about evangelism growing up as a young believer, I thought it was up to me to save all my friends. And I missed that whole collective sense of it's up to us as brothers and sisters in Christ to reach out to the nations. So can we do it together? Yeah. And that helps with those kind of, I don't know what I'm going to say, I don't know where to go, I don't know what to do. Other people were much more bold than me. Marianne's so much bolder than I am. And so she would knock on the door and then she'd go, Tom, you talk. Because my French was a little better than hers was. So it was a great teamwork relationship. But if it had just been down to me, wow, I don't know if I would have had the same boldness to go out. So those were some things that helped me to do it.
Go a little deeper on those first two. Give some examples. What were some of the things that you were already passionate about or knowledgeable in? And then explain a little bit more of what do you mean by breaking that sound barrier?
Yeah, so volleyball is a perfect example. So I learned to play volleyball in college with Roger Stover. When I was at Grace, I had to take a PE credit, and that was the only one that fit my schedule.
That's awesome.
And I got this passion for volleyball. I just love it. And whether it's beach or whether it's indoor, it doesn't matter. And finding a club right away, that introduced me to like 25 other guys. Guys are harder to meet in foreign cultures, typically. At least that's my experience.
Yeah.
So 25 guys, and I'm sitting in the locker room not understanding 80% of the conversation. I felt so stupid. I felt so ill-equipped to do it. But spending time with them, and then they saw that I kept hanging in there and I kept doing it. I did a basketball club as well when I was in France. So using kind of those interests that I had, and then I learned a lot of French because of it, and I just had those relationships. They started to know, even if they called me an American or whatever, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
It was being in contact with people. So any of that life-on-life stuff, that's what's going to present the opportunities then to share more.
I love that, because especially if it's something that you're passionate about and something that you're skilled in and you're good, there, like, God can use that too, because then you're like spiking the ball on them or hitting the three in their face, and they're like, "Oh, okay, this guy's good. He knows me." Oh my God, yeah, and then that helps too. All right, breaking the sound barrier. What does that look like? I'm assuming like it's easy to like wave to your neighbor and say hello on the street, but are you talking about like actually having a conversation, or where are you going with that?
Well, no, it's not. It's not easy on the street. People will cross the street to avoid passing someone close, so they don't have to give them a greeting, because some of the cultures in Europe still have something of a class society. So your greeting has to fit that. And if you don't know what those circumstances are or where the other person fits, you're not sure how to greet them. It's not impolite necessarily. It's just you don't know what to do. So trying to find natural ways. So a dumb little example, we would have to roll our bins out like garbage cans in front of the house. And with neighbors, I would watch for when they were going out to get their bin. And I'd go out and get mine at the same time. So it was a kind of this natural activity that we were both out there. And that was a way to help break the sound barrier. Going to borrow a tool, making myself, revealing my need, and almost making me in their debt by asking to borrow something. It's hard for an American, right? We want to have all this stuff. We want to do it ourselves, self-made people, all this kind of stuff. And just going to ask to borrow a tool was a great way to break the sound barrier. If we get mail that was misdelivered, it was a perfect opportunity to go and I'd note their name, because I don't remember names very well. So I'd note their name. And that way I could then the next time say, "Hello, Francois," or, whatever, because now I knew their name. And it's those little things that start to build a relationship when the other person, frankly, isn't interested at all. I have no value in their eyes. But if I, little by little, kind of weave that together, then they're more interested in talking to me.
I love that. That's so good. I think a lot of people I know say, "I'm not good with names." And I'm like, well, if you're intentional and if you're wise, if you have a system about it, I've had people say, "Eric, you're really good with names." But I work really hard at it.
Yeah.
And so like, I actually have a note on my phone that's called Names to Remember. And when I meet a new barista at the coffee shop that I like going to, I'll write their name down. And just writing it down helps me remember it. I love when people wear name tags.
Yeah.
I'll call them by their name.
Yeah.
If they're the cashier, or it helps me remember their name. Using it in a conversation. Like, those are really simple tips that can make a big difference. That's awesome. All right, so let's talk biblically here for a second.
Sure.
Sometimes I think there's this stigma of like, well, go, the Great Commission, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. And I think sometimes people are like, well, I'm not called to go and be a missionary. I do have a job. I'm maybe you're a high school student, you go to a public school and you're like, I want to be a mechanic, or I want to go, be a police officer. I'm not called to go live in France and be a missionary. How can we still live out that mission? Your wife and I even were just talking the other day about this, the go, that it's like, as you go, wherever you go, look for the opportunities. So elaborate on that a little bit. What are other passages of scripture maybe that would point in that direction or lend support to that?
Yeah, I think everywhere throughout scripture in God's big story, you see this idea that it's about the nations. All the way back to Genesis 11, where it's God who creates different languages, so therefore different cultures. And we tend to think that's a bad thing because it was the Tower of Babel and all this. But it's actually a blessing that he creates those so that man can't do life without God. So now we need both each other and we need God, and we can't do it on our own. So the nations start there. And then we see it all the way at the other end in Revelation 7. You've got people from every tongue, tribe, nation, and people worshiping God. Those distinctions don't disappear. They don't go away when we get to heaven. They're still there. So God is using the nations, and I even say, and I know this is a tough one, he's even using things like migration and people movements from places that maybe we can't even get to with the gospel. He's bringing some of those folks right into our neighborhoods. So Matthew's way of writing the Great Commission is, as you're going, wherever you go, if you go into the garage and you're a mechanic, if you go wherever into the studio to make a recording, whatever you're doing, make disciples. So the point is, are you actively looking for ways to make disciples with whoever crosses my path? And the other story that I always go to is, who is my neighbor? You have this religious Pharisee who's trying to figure out, what do I need to do to really be accepted by God? Jesus says, follow the commandments. He says, I do all that stuff. Then he says, love your neighbor. And the guy's question is, who's my neighbor? And he tells this story about the Samaritan, who was probably the last person that Jews would have thought of as their neighbor. He picks the one that's the most different from them and says, that's the one who is the good neighbor. So that's where I start when I talk about all this stuff. Whoever God's brought into your life, that's your neighbor. And we have this neighbor who just moved in. They're from Brazil. So now I have to look for ways to be a good neighbor to these Brazilian people. I don't know very much about Brazilian culture at all, but I'm learning. Now I'm starting to look for ways to say a greeting in Brazil, in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, to greet them and those kinds of things. So it's taking the small opportunities to be Jesus to whoever crosses my path, whatever that looks like.
I love it. So for people in those contexts, as let's maybe even just take this high school student that goes to a public high school, because you've got access to everybody in the community. And in your public high school, you probably have people who their native tongue is a different language. What are some of the common challenges or maybe even misconceptions in connecting with people from different cultures?
My mind went in two different directions when you asked the question. One was, Jesus himself was an immigrant and a refugee, So, and we're actually called to live as pilgrims and aliens, whatever translation you use for those verses. So there's something about being the outsider and something about welcoming the outsider. And so that's where I would go first, is try to put yourself in their feet. How are they feeling as they've come into this maybe huge high school where most everybody speaks English, but they don't as well? How can I be a good neighbor to them? How can I make them feel welcome? How can I show hospitality in Jesus' name? Give them a cup of water. Remember all those stories from the Gospels? What are ways that I can remember their name? Say their name the way they say it, not the way I want to say it. Because we destroy people's names. And that our name is often one of the things we value the most, right? So learn to say it like they would like to say it. And then find ways. You can see when they're lost. They're like, oh, what do I do now? Help them with those little things of just the basic gestures, the basic customs, the ways to get into culture. How do you find your way to class? Oh, you don't know where 306 is. Yeah, that's the one that's really hard to find because it's all the way up 3 sets of stairs. Those little things like that.
I love that. That's really good. What are some of the maybe ways that you could help people better understand and appreciate other cultures? Are there tips, tricks, encouragement that you might give, advice in understanding that?
I would go one from just a biblical level. God created it all. So he loves the diversity. So I think if we're going to be after God's heart, part of it is loving the diversity, as hard as it can be sometimes, because I think in our sinful selves, we don't like what's different. So pushing ourselves a little bit to go to what is different, that's one thing that I would say. Another thing, it's a simple little tool. It's called the country comparison tool. You can look it up, search it on the web, country comparison tool. You can put in any 4 countries. So you could put in the United States, and for me, with my example with my neighbor, I put in Brazil. And it's going to show you 6 bar graphs that are on these 6 dimensions that a man called Gert Hofstede, he used in the 60s and 70s to help us understand cultures better, cultural difference. And right away you can see like their attitude toward authority is going to be very different than my attitude toward authority. So if I try to just play like everybody's equal, they may feel uncomfortable. And it just gives me little hints. Of course, everyone doesn't follow their national culture exactly, but it at least gives me some starting points of how I can engage in conversation. And I might see where there might be some tension points that I can avoid if I'm careful.
I love that. That's really cool. Thank you for sharing those.
Mm-hmm.
I think sometimes if you're just aware and you're looking for those opportunities that you're referencing, my favorite thing is I'll almost like borderline play dumb and just ask questions.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I saw that you don't eat school lunch and you always bring your own food. Why do you do that? Like, hey, I've noticed that you, I don't know, maybe you say something different. Like, does that mean something to you?
Mm-hmm.
Or even I love what you shared, like oh my goodness, saying their name the way that they say it. Like asking the meaning of their name or where the heritage of their name. Was that a family name? Do you know what your name means? Like going into those places, but asking questions, being curious, learning about them, and putting yourself obviously in their shoes is a big deal. Yeah, thank you. All right, what practical steps would you give for somebody? Maybe they've done this work. Maybe they've, there is a family that moved into your neighborhood and they're of a different culture, different ethnicity. What practical steps would you give them? And you did some. Go further on that of like, pulling in the trash bins or I always say like weather is a big deal. Like when it snows, go shovel your driveway at the same time and help them, right? Like using those things. What are other ways that maybe you have seen or that you would encourage to foster meaningful relationships with those in other cultures?
First one, and I think we forget it sometimes, so I mention it anyways, is to start praying for them.
Absolutely.
Even if you don't know their name, start praying for them. And this was a thing that Tom Julian shared with us way back on the field, was a contact book. Write a list of names of people that you're praying for that you want them to know about Jesus. So start praying for them. Even if you don't know their name, Marianne, when she started her contact list, it was the lady with the red hat and the lady with the scarf, and that was just a way to remember till they shared their name, So you can always fill it in later. So really praying that God would use you to open them up to the gospel. Learning their name, then obviously that's a big one, and using it. Festivals or important moments. Like if you're having a birthday, who in your neighborhood could you invite over? Not just your family, but what neighbors could you invite? Yeah. If they're having a festival, can you go over, instead of just being mad about the noise, can you find out why they're celebrating? What's going on? What's happening? Use those occasions. American holidays that they might not know about. Can you give them a little bit of an orientation? But the biggest one, you mentioned it already, is just asking questions. We assume, and that's the biggest problem, I think, we assume so many things about the other. We assume we know why. We assume we understand. We assume about their motivations. And so just ask some questions. And I found in asking questions, if you can avoid the word why somehow always has a bit of a feel of judgment.
Okay.
Why are you doing that? Even if you do it the nicest way, so figure out another way to do it. Oh, what's behind that? Say more about why you do.
That's good.
I used why again, but not why do you do that? Because somehow, as much as we try, it still puts someone on the defensive.
I can see that. Yeah.
So say more about that, or what is it like when you do this, or how did you get to that point? Are all ways of sort of asking the same thing, but in a slightly different way.
That's so good. That's genius. Yeah, you're exactly right. I think that there is a context and applied judgment there that can come with a why question. I like that. That's very good. I think sometimes when we're looking at like there's people of a different culture and I don't know and I understand, talk a little bit more about that assumption. Where do you think that comes from? Why do we make assumptions about other people that we don't know? How does that hinder those relationships and get in the way?
Wow. If I'm brutally honest, it's because I'm so concerned about me. And I think I matter, and so I think everybody should think like I do. And if we get more and more Jesus' view of us, that we should diminish, he should increase, then I'm free with just a little bit of humility to show a genuine interest in them and ask. And that's part of it. And then really trying to figure out, okay, they might even do some of the same things. And I would say this is even with people in America, in the sense that different generations might do things very differently. And we assume we knew why that is too. And I think the same cross-cultural skills that help us with other nations help us with different generations and people that are different from us here in the United States.
That's well said.
Not assuming too much, because it just creates obstacles to building a relationship.
I think there is a lot there. We could probably do an entire conversation or episode on that.
Yeah.
Making assumptions. But I love the direction you're going there. Like, if we're honest, and I hope that in these contexts, we will be honest with ourselves, even in church, even in like pastoral ministry, we think we know best, or we've concluded this is what I would do. So therefore it must be what other people would do. And that has a huge ramification in terms of ministry, in terms of relationships. And so if you're not willing to ask questions, thank you for helping not ask the why, but ask good questions to be curious and learn and understand. That sometimes I think opens those doors for the conversation to take place, for the, breaking the sound barriers, to use your phrase. That's a big deal. That's a really big deal.
One of the things that's become kind of a mantra to me that I keep repeating to myself is nobody does something because they think it's stupid. There's always a reason for why they do it.
Yes.
They've come to the same conclusions that I have. I'm acting this way because I think it's the best. They act that way because they think it's the best. So what is the motivation? What's behind it? And that's helped me to kind of get out of myself again. Nobody does something because they think it's stupid. There's a reason. So what is the reason?
Yes, that's really helpful. All right. Another obstacle that I think we would maybe both agree sometimes that can hinder us engaging. If we're Christ followers, we're seeing people of different ethnicities. Maybe we do have a desire to get to know them, to even build that relationship. Our hope would be that we could engage in spiritual conversations, but maybe we don't know about their faith background. I think sometimes we might be really good at building a relationship with somebody. This actually doesn't even apply to people of different cultures. We do this humanly anyways, where we're like, I want to have a spiritual conversation with them, but I don't quite know how to get there. I want to be sensitive to their faith, to their view. I understand the gospel is controversial or sounds judgmental. Hey, you're a sinner. You deserve hell, or and yet the grace of God. How do you bridge that conversation with people who have different cultural backgrounds, maybe a different faith perspective? How do we be sensitive to that, I guess, is what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, and I know this can be a touchy subject for some, because maybe they feel like we just need to announce the gospel and not kind of mess around too much with other things. But I've become more convinced, studying cultures, that we use words that we assume the other person knows what we mean. And I'm really convinced that there are times we share the gospel and the other person has no idea what we're talking about.
Yes.
So how do I get to know the other person and bring up questions of faith? The same way that I would hope they would do with me, and that is ask questions. Oh, I saw you did that. Is there a faith or a spiritual thing behind there? Say more about it.
Yeah.
And I think it's showing genuine interest. I used to think I had to be the expert on every world religion so that I knew how to answer everything. but I forgot that's not what being a witness is. A witness is just saying what I saw and what I know. I'm not the expert witness. Yes. You can call those people in, that's fine.
Yes.
But I'm just a witness to what I know. So if I show genuine interest, like I hope they would show genuine interest in me, then I'm going to get to the things that are important to them. And I can ask that question, is faith or spiritual things, is that a part of your life? Yeah. Oh, interesting. Tell me about that. What do you do? What are your celebrations like? What's it based on? And I can find out, I think, is this naive? I don't think so. I can find out everything I need to know to be able to then bring the gospel to bear on what they're living in a way that is going to be meaningful because they've talked about what's meaningful to them. And then I can share my story and what Scripture has to say about where they're living.
Yep, for sure. Oh, man, that's really good. I love how you're weaving that in there and talking about that. So let's go a step further in that context. What role does like hospitality play in that? How can we be people who are not only curious and asking good questions, but maybe let's say you get to that point where you're like, I'd really like to invite this family over for dinner, or I'd like to get to know them and their culture better. Maybe it's, hey, would you be willing to cook a traditional meal that we could engage in together in your culture? Like, what does that process look like? How can we be sensitive to that, the cultural dynamics as well in terms of hospitality?
Wow. It's such a good question, but it's so multifaceted. So
sure.
A big part of it is sensitivity and awareness, like watch for the signals. So when I offer some hospitality, how open are they to that? Do they bristle? And some of those reactions are like microseconds.
Yeah.
So I got to be really aware. I sort of have to have my antenna up if I'm going to do it. But and that might be an area where it's worth asking someone else who knows that culture, like what does hospitality look like for them? Because if I go over and offer an apple pie or whatever, and they don't eat fruit, it's probably not going to accomplish what I'm hoping it will. So probably getting some information as much as I can. Okay. But yeah, I say that, and then it's being who you are. You have to be who you are too. And if you go so far that you're, bending over totally, then that's not going to work either. So you got to be genuine about who you are, but then look for ways that are going to be meaningful for them. And starting small is probably better than starting big. And doing multiple small things will probably get you further down the road than one huge, big thing.
Yes. Yeah, that's good. I think it's important to be mindful and aware. I love what you're saying there. To oversimplify, it would be like, if I'm trying to reach somebody who's Spanish speaking in my neighborhood and I say, hey, do you want to go get Taco Bell? That they're probably offended or not.
Absolutely.
Right. And even if I say, hey, my favorite Mexican restaurant here in town is XYZ, and I say the name of it, they might go, we would never eat there.
Yeah.
Right. So understanding how that plays into that. But I love that if you've done your homework, if you're asking good questions, if you're understanding their culture, if you are being curious in those ways, I think there are times where those natural next steps can take place. And I love even the watch their body language, be aware, have your antenna up. That's super helpful, Tom. Well, we wanted this kind of to be part one of a two-part conversation. We're really focusing here a lot on for us as individuals. If we would welcome you to join the next part of this part two, because we're going to look at how do we do this in the context of our local church. And so that's part two. We would encourage you to come back to listen to part two. And we're going to go a little bit deeper here for those of you who are pastors, who you're active, you're engaged in your local church community. How do we do this on a larger scale outside of just us as individuals and family members, or even in our public school and community? How do you do it within your church context? So come back to the next episode, check it out. Tom, share with us, for maybe the people who aren't going to hop on to part two, how can they connect with you? How can they find out some of the resources that you provide?
We have a website. It's coachingcultures.org or tom@coachingcultures.org. You can get in touch with me, and I'd be glad to work with you on any level that would be helpful.
Well, you're going to be at Momentum Youth Conference this summer as well, and doing a power track, so that would be even another way.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would highly encourage you to check out Tom's power track. It's going to be awesome. So thanks so much for joining us. That'll do it for today's episode. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. We hope you found it to be valuable. And if you did, would you share it with someone else in your network who might enjoy it? Also, would you please go on and subscribe, rate, and review it? That way you don't miss any more and somebody else will be able to find it too. Also, because we want to be your trusted resource, if you have a question or topic that you would like us to discuss on an upcoming episode, send that to us via email to info@buildmomentum.org, or you can send us a DM on any of our social media platforms. You can find us there at Momentum Ministry Partners. Also, if you need more information on our ministry, be sure to check out our website at buildmomentum.org. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you next time.